Hello and welcome to a special interview for The Wire supported by Glenlivet Books. The Modi government's decision to put up a statue of Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose at India Gate is a much-deserved, though belated honor. But it raises a critical question. How would Netaji view the Modi government? And I'm talking specifically about its attitude to minorities and perhaps in particular, its treatment of Muslims. That's the key question I shall raise today. And my guest is perhaps one of the few people in the world who perhaps knows. He's the Gardiner Professor of History at Harvard University, the chairperson of the Netaji Research Bureau in Calcutta, and more importantly, he's Netaji's biographer as well as his grandnephew, Sugata Bose. Professor Bose, Netaji's statue at the heart of the Indian capital is a much-deserved, though highly delayed honor. But how would Netaji view the fact that his statue will be standing under a canopy that was originally intended for a king emperor against whom Netaji probably spent a large part of his life politically fighting?
Well, you are absolutely right to say that on Netaji's 125th birth anniversary, the announcement to have a statue at a very prominent place in New Delhi is a belated but fully deserved honor. Now, as you know, the title of my biography of Netaji is His Majesty's Opponent. And so there may actually well be an element of poetic justice in Netaji occupying the space vacated by the King Emperor. He had spent his entire life fighting for Indian independence. And more importantly, in the climactic phase of our struggle, he wanted to replace the loyalty of Indian soldiers to the King Emperor with a new loyalty to the cause of Indian freedom. And in that, he succeeded remarkably during the Second World War and in its aftermath when he was no longer there. But you wanted to ask me about the Modi government, which has, of course, made this decision. But it's very important at this stage to point out what are the values that Netaji really stood for. So my initial reaction when I heard this news 2 days before Netaji's birthday was that the best monument to Netaji would be to adorn and enlarge his legacy of equality and unity. He was the man who was perhaps the most successful among all of our leaders of the Indian nationalist movement in uniting Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs, Christians on the basis of equal rights and equal respect for all. He had the implicit trust of the minorities. And so I think he would have been quite dismayed to see how the minorities are being discriminated against in today's India. And he would have liked to see the leaders of contemporary India unambiguously condemning the hate speech emanating from certain platforms, which are not quite the same, but not entirely unaffiliated with the ruling dispensation today.
Let me ask you a few specific questions that pertain to things that are either happening today or have actually been said by very senior political leaders like the Prime Minister or the Chief Minister of Uttar Pradesh. For instance, the Prime Minister refers to the Sultanate period of Indian history and the Mughal period as 1200 saal ki gulami, 1200 years of slavery. Yogi Adityanath has publicly said the Mughals cannot be anyone's heroes. But in his book, An Indian Pilgrim, Netaji wrote about how he viewed both the Mughal emperors and the Muslim kings of Bengal. Did he view their rule as slavery?
Never. He wrote not just in An Indian Pilgrim, but also in his book, The Indian Struggle. And he said so in numerous speeches that he gave in his political career, that Indians felt conquered only with the advent of British rule in India. He thought that even when there were Muslim sovereigns, whether in Bengal during the Sultanate period and the Nawabi, or in India during the Mughal Empire, the administration was run jointly by Hindus and Muslims. Also, let us not forget that his goal was to reach the Red Fort of Old Delhi. He was less concerned about New Delhi, and that was because he saw the Red Fort as a symbol of sovereignty. And it's important to note that he visited the grave of the last Mughal Emperor Bahadur Shah Zafar in September 1943. There was a parade of the Indian National Army in front of that tomb, and that's where Netaji gave his stirring call, Jai Hind, and also Chalo Delhi. And so he respected the Mughals and felt that Akbar in particular had brought together all of the different religious communities of India at that time. So it's important to remember also that there were a very large number of Muslims, a disproportionate number, in fact, in Netaji's Azad Hind movement. His closest associates happened to be Muslims. You know, my father, Shishir Kumar Bose, drove him on his escape from Calcutta to Gomo. But the man who received him in Peshawar was Mian Akbar Shah, who was a Muslim freedom fighter from the Northwest Frontier province. The only companion, only Indian companion, that is, on his submarine voyage in early 1943 was Abid Hassan, a Muslim from Hyderabad in the south, and he was possibly his closest aide, both in Europe and Asia. And the commander of the first division of the INA was Muhammad Zaman Kiani. We talk about the raising of the Indian tricolour in Moirang near Imphal. That was done by an INA officer called Shaukat Malik. And the last journey of his was a tragic one, and the only companion was Habibur Rahman. And we all know that in the Red Fort, the British made a major error of decision by putting on trial a Hindu and a Muslim and a Sikh, Prem Saigal, Shahnawaz Khan, and Gurbakh Singh Dhillon. And he also had very fine Christian officers in the INA. For example, Cyril John Stracey, who built the INA Memorial in Singapore. He was asked to do so by Netaji on 15th August 1945. Can you do it, he asked, before the British land in Singapore? And Stracey said, yes, of course, and said Jai Hind, and he kept his promise.
In fact, in a nutshell, and I'm going to pick up a phrase from that quotation of Netaji's from Indian Pilgrim, he said, it is a misnomer to talk of the Mughal period as Muslim rule. He went out of his way to show that the commander-in-chiefs, the generals, and many important cabinet ministers were Hindu. In other words, this was a joint rule. It wasn't slavery. It wasn't Muslim rule. Am I right in saying that?
You're absolutely right. And that word is extremely important that you've picked out from an Indian Pilgrim, a misnomer to regard the second sort of the middle part of the second millennium of the Common Era as a period of Muslim rule. This is what the colonial rulers taught us in terms of thinking about the periodization of Indian history as Hindu, Muslim, and then finally British. And Netaji, for one, never accepted that characterization.
Now, when Netaji founded the Indian National Army, he chose Tipu Sultan's springing tiger as its insignia, and it was worn on every epaulet. The army's motto is three simple, redolent Urdu words, Ittihad, Itmad, or Qurbani. So how would Netaji view today an almost conscious attempt being made to distance oneself from, sometimes even to disrespect Urdu, and to deny India's Muslim heritage by changing the names of cities like Allahabad or Mughal Sarai? How would he view that?
I think he would have been quite dismayed. He honored those Muslim rulers who had tried to resist the British colonial conquest of India. And even if you read his stirring proclamation of the Azad Hind government, which he wrote on the night of 19th, 20th October, and then read out on the 21st of October, he specifically mentions Tipu Sultan by name. And he also, of course, mentions Nawab Siraj-ud-Dawla. And he talks about the joint resistance of Hindus and Muslims to colonial rule. So I think he would have been aghast at the way in which history is being distorted. As you pointed out, initially in the Indian tricolour that he adopted in Europe, there was the springing tiger in the center. Once he came to Southeast Asia, he decided to adopt the flag, the tricolour, with the charkha in the middle. And that is because he wanted to make common cause with Mahatma Gandhi. But on all the shoulder pieces of the INA uniforms, there was the insignia of Tipu Sultan's tiger. He was making some very deliberate and conscious attempts to forge unity and have a spirit of religious harmony in his Indian National Army. And he chose Hindustani, a mixture of Hindi and Urdu, with lots of Urdu words in it as the link language of his movement. And he used the Roman script so that the many Tamils and people from South India who joined the movement could easily read some of the orders of the day that he issued. So in his speeches, I've heard this from Prem Saigal, who was from Lahore. And so he was fluent in Urdu, and he would be going with Prem Saigal and asking for Urdu words, the equivalents, which he would then use in his speeches. And how can we forget that he said in one of his first speeches, "Hum zinda rahe ya mare, wo koi baat nahi hai. Sahi baat ye hai, ahem baat ye hai, Hindustan azad hoga." And he raised this prospect of saying, "Jab hum phir Lal Kile Delhi pe jaakar wahan hamare victory parade karenge." And he couldn't even complete his sentence because there was a huge applause from an audience that included Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs, Christians, Punjabis, Pathans, Tamils, Marathi speakers, Hindi speakers, and so on, Urdu speakers, of course.
Now, I'm very glad to hear that, because the one point you've underlined is Netaji had no antipathy or allergy to Urdu. He used it frequently, he used it deliberately. And also, Netaji would not have denied India's Muslim heritage by going out of his way to change names of cities, historical names like Mughal Sarai and Allahabad. Let me read something else. Last month, at a Dharm Sansad in Hardwar, we heard blood-curdling calls for the genocide of Muslims for ethnic cleansing. 6 weeks have lapsed, and there hasn't been any criticism. In fact, there hasn't been even a comment by either the Prime Minister or the government. If Netaji had been alive and had heard these calls, how would he have responded?
He would, well, first of all, I would say that if Netaji had been around, I think no one would have dared in India to issue those kinds of calls for genocide of India's most significant religious minority. He believed in what he repeatedly described as the need for cultural intimacy. Now, this went beyond mere tolerance of other religious faiths. He felt that the Indian religious communities were a little too distant from one another. And that's why he talked about cultural intimacy. And he first mentioned that phrase in a speech that he gave as president of the Maharashtra Provincial Congress going back to 1928. And he never veered from that path. I think there should have been unambiguous and strong condemnation from the Prime Minister and from the highest echelons of the government when these kinds of hate speeches were made. And if we truly believe in Netaji's political legacy, that is what should be done. You cannot simply worship him in statue and not accept his ideals of equality among all of India's religious communities and linguistic groups. And also men and women, I might add. He believed in gender equity as well.
Now, in a speech Netaji gave as Congress President on the 14th of June 1938 in Comilla, he specifically addressed the problem of communalism. He said, and I'm quoting, "We hear voices of Hindu Raj. These are useless thoughts. Do the communal organizations solve any of the problems confronted by the working class? Do any such organizations have any answer to unemployment and poverty?" How would he therefore regard attempts being made in various quarters today to convert India from a secular country into a Hindu Rashtra?
Again, he would have been dismayed and distressed to see those kinds of developments in today's India. Now, he was someone who was a spiritual person, who was himself very devout, but he would not speak his religion. He did not publicly display any desire to go to temples, even though I have to say that he sent my father and a sister of his to the Dakshineshwar Kali temple quietly to seek the blessings of the Divine Mother before the Great Escape of January of 1941. But that was not public. Also, Abid Hassan and also Muhammad Zaman Kiani have written, and I have heard this story directly from Abid Hassan, that in October 1921, he refused to go to the main Chettiar temple in Singapore on grounds that they did not admit members of the subordinated castes, not to mention people belonging to other religious faiths. And Abid Hassan said that, oh no, we are losing a big donation from the Chettiars. But then the Chettiars came back saying that you can hold a national meeting in the premises of the temple and you can bring whoever you want. And flanked by Muhammad Zaman Kiani and Abid Hassan, he went there. And Abid Hassan said that Netaji made a speech which he remembered as if it was a symphony of religious harmony. That is what sustained Abid Hassan when he went to fight in the battle for Imphal. So for a man like that, it would be utterly dismaying to see what has been going on in India. And of course, in the late 1930s, he stood against the politics of the Hindu Mahasabha and made that absolutely clear in his writings.
If I recall the episode you're describing about the visit to the Chettiar temple, when he walked out of the temple, he immediately wiped the tilak that had been put on his forehead. He did not want it to be a symbol that would somehow divide his army. He removed it at once.
That's correct. And Abid Hassan said that he saw Netaji and followed suit.
Now, I want to ask you one more question about how Netaji would view the Modi government's treatment, in particular of Muslims, before I broaden the subject. You pointed out at great length how Netaji's closest and most trusted colleagues, including the person who was on that last fatal flight with him, were Muslims. Muslims represent 15% of our population, yet there isn't a single Muslim Lok Sabha MP in the ruling BJP. There's only one Muslim in Mr. Modi's cabinet. And since 1989, the BJP hasn't put up a single Muslim as a candidate in any election in Gujarat, whether at the state level or the national level. What would Netaji make of that particular deliberate attempt by a ruling party to exclude Muslims?
You know, I pointed this out in my maiden speech in Parliament in June of 2014, when I was a member of the 16th Lok Sabha, that I looked around and said that this representative body is not as representative of India's diversity as it should be. And therefore, some of us had to take it upon ourselves to speak for the voiceless who had been denied representation. And this is very bad for our democracy if certain communities, the minorities, feel excluded from our political process. Netaji was quite the opposite from what our ruling dispensation does today. They won't even give nominations to members of religious minorities in elections, both at the national level and at the state level, even when there are significant religious minorities in our population at the state. By contrast, Netaji gave disproportionate, or shall I say, weighted representation to members of the religious minorities. There were so many Muslims and Sikhs in his cabinet, which he formed, of the Azad Hind government on 21st October. And we find, I've told you the names, I have recited the names of his closest political associates. And you can see from that how deeply he trusted members of the religious minorities. And they, in return, said that he is the leader whom we have. We are prepared to do everything for him. I still remember, trying to interview Mehboob Ahmed, who was Netaji's military secretary in 1945, after Prem Saigal went to the war front. And I was doing this interview in Patna. He's from Bihar. And I had to stop the camera because he would just weep profusely as he talked about his leader. And then he said that, look, I have had the good fortune of working with Mahatma Gandhi. I had the good fortune of working with Jawaharlal Nehru post-independence. He became our ambassador to many foreign countries, including Canada. But then he said, do you know why I'm becoming so emotional? There was only one man that I was prepared to die for, and that was Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose. And he was able to evoke that kind of affection and loyalty because he treated everyone, Muslims, Sikhs, Christians, equally. And he was absolutely set against the politics of trying to achieve Hindu supremacy.
So in a nutshell, Professor Bose, Netaji would have been both a sharp and an outspoken critic of the way the Modi government treats minorities, and Muslims in particular.
He would have been, but I think that, he would not have let that kind of politics of religious bigotry and hatred to gain the upper hand in India. And it's incumbent on us as citizens of India today to actually convey, as we are doing in this program, to the people of India what Netaji truly believed in, what he stood for. Because I think there's still a lot to be learned from his book of life. And if we want to build a truly united India based on equal rights and equal respect for all, then we need to follow his example.
I want to touch on two other things, but before I come to that, I'll just underline for the audience that you agree that if Netaji were alive today, he would be a sharp and outspoken critic of the Modi government's attitude and treatment of Muslims. Let me now come to two other quick issues before I end. It's no secret that the Modi government doesn't like Nehru and is determined to either undermine or at least cast doubt on Nehru's legacy. Netaji knew and worked very closely with Nehru in the 1930s. How did he view him? And how would Netaji have viewed this attempt today to denigrate and dismiss Nehru?
Subhash Chandra Bose regarded Jawaharlal Nehru as his elder brother. He said as much in letters that he wrote. They were very close in the 1920s and 1930s. Both were the idols of the students and youth of India. They both together represented the left-leaning tendency within the Indian National Congress. Netaji spoke about Samyavada. He wanted a form of socialism suited to Indian conditions. Now, they did have some differences in 1939 when Netaji stood against Gandhi's favored candidate for a second term as Congress president. And I should add that he won not just because he had support in Bengal, he won in UP, in Punjab, and so on. So he had a nationwide appeal even in those days. And at that time, he felt that Nehru didn't fully support him, and he felt somewhat let down. And he wrote to Nehru saying that you're riding two horses. But then as you can see, once he formed the Indian National Army, even though they had some differences in terms of how to assess the international situation, and Netaji wanted to take full advantage of the international war crisis to strike for India's freedom, he made sure that the 3 brigades of his first division of the INA were named after Gandhi, Nehru, and Azad. And Nehru, in turn, decided to put on his barrister's gown for the first time in a quarter of a century to join the defense team led by Tej Bahadur Sapru and Bhulabhai Desai at the time of the Red Fort trials of Saigal Dhillon and Shah Nawaz. And Nehru also made a very moving reference to Netaji in his first speech at the Red Fort in August 1947. In fact, in that speech, he mentioned only 2 persons by name. One was naturally Mahatma Gandhi, and the second was Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose. He said that this should have been his day. He had raised the flag of independence for us. And now that I'm doing it at the Red Fort, that is the person I'm missing today.
In fact, something people don't know is that when Netaji was president of Congress in his first term, 1938, he created what was called the Planning Committee and appointed Nehru as its chairman. In independent India, Nehru converted the Planning Committee into the Planning Commission. But the legacy and the idea and the origin goes back to Netaji, which then Nehru took and formalized as a Planning Commission. So I take it Netaji would not have been someone who would have dismissed and denigrated Nehru.
He would not have. In fact, he waited for Nehru to return from Europe before launching the National Planning Committee as Congress president, because he wanted Nehru to be its chairman if it was to be a success, as he put it. And Rabindranath Tagore at that time said that he could see only 2 modernists in the Congress, Nehru and Bose. And so he tried to urge Mahatma Gandhi to let Netaji have a second term, because Nehru was already chair of the National Planning Committee.
Now, because beating retreat is on Saturday, I want to ask you if there's any way of knowing how Netaji would have regarded Abide With Me. Would he have seen it as Christian, un-Indian, and colonial, and therefore something that should be got rid of? Or would he have wanted to preserve and protect it, not just because of the haunting melody, but also because it was Mahatma Gandhi's beloved favorite hymn?
Netaji would have wanted to preserve Abide With Me. And let me give you an anecdote. This is something that both my father, Shishir Kumar Bose, and my mother, Krishna Bose, have written about in their accounts of Netaji and the Bose brothers. You know, Nehru always stayed in Calcutta as the guest of my grandfather, Sharath Chandra Bose. And both Mahatma Gandhi and Nehru were staying at Sharath Bose's home at One Woodburn Park in 1937, at the time of a meeting of the All India Congress Committee in October and November of 1937. And there would be Gandhi's prayer meetings held on the terrace of the house. And both my parents have written, based on the historical evidence and what my father remembered, that the famous singer and musician, Dilip Kumar Roy, used to sing for Mahatma Gandhi. And one of the songs that he always performed in the presence of Gandhiji and Subhash Chandra Bose on the terrace of that house was Abide With Me. And when Dilip Kumar Roy sang, my father has written that tears would flow down the cheeks of Subhash Chandra Bose. Not just when he sang his patriotic songs composed by his father, Vijendralal Roy, but he was very eclectic in his appreciation of music. In fact, when he was in Mandalay jail in the mid-1920s, he went on a hunger strike to demand that the British jailers should give them musical instruments. And he believed that human beings needed to have music in their hearts in order to be good human beings. So we know that Subhash Chandra Bose loved Abide With Me as much as Mahatma Gandhi. And he was broad-minded, he was generous of spirit.
Thank you for that. I'm just repeating it. Tears would flow down Netaji's eyes when he heard Abide With Me, and he loved Abide With Me as much as Mahatma Gandhi did. My last question, Professor Bose, as you mentioned yourself, even though in 1939, Gandhi forced Netaji's resignation during his second term as Congress president, how would Netaji have viewed BJP MPs who today have started to lionize Gandhi's assassin Nathuram Godse? And how would he view these so-called temples that they want to erect in Godse's name?
You know, Nehru, of course, had said that he would step in front of anyone who tried to assassinate Gandhi. And Netaji was completely devoted to the man whom he first referred to as father of our nation. What I would say is that, you know, the Netaji and the Mahatma had their last meeting in June of 1940. And Netaji pleaded with Mahatma Gandhi to launch another mass movement. And Gandhi said that, that the country is not yet ready. But he added at the end of their heart-to-heart talk, that's what Netaji writes in the Indian struggle, that if freedom came through the path taken by Netaji, then Gandhiji's congratulatory telegram would be the first to reach him. He also met two other people. His longest meeting, of course, was and the most intimate one was with Gandhiji in Wardha in June 1940. He did meet Muhammad Ali Jinnah, and he asked Jinnah to join the Congress in a united movement and said in that case, Jinnah would be the first Prime Minister of United India. But Jinnah did not accept that proposal. And then he also met Savarkar, and he's very critical of Savarkar in the Indian struggle, saying that he's completely oblivious of the international situation, and all that he wants is to get Hindus to get military training by getting into the British Indian Army, while Netaji was trying to achieve exactly the opposite. He was trying to wean away Indian soldiers from the British side and get them to fight for freedom, and rising above British divisions of martial and non-martial races and so forth. And as for Godse, who was the assassin of the father of our nation, he would have just had nothing but the strongest possible condemnation. And I just wanted to also add that just 1 week before Gandhiji's assassination, it was Netaji's birthday, 23rd January, and he was asked by someone about Netaji, and he said that no one has evoked so much affection and loyalty among all of India's religious communities and linguistic groups as Netaji has. And Gandhiji said a week before he was assassinated by Godse that in memory of that great patriot, cleanse your hearts of all communal bitterness. So the Mahatma and Netaji were at one when they believed in the equality of all of India's religious communities.
And there is no way that Netaji would ever lionize the Mahatma's assassin, would ever approve of people building temples in Godse's name. I just underline that again for the audience because I think it's a very important point that you've made there. But embedded in that answer was a gem and a jewel. Can I, before I end, pluck it out? If I heard you correctly, you said in 1940, Netaji met Jinnah and said to Jinnah, join Congress and you will be the first Prime Minister of independent India. In other words, Netaji said this 6-7 years before Gandhi said it. Gandhi wasn't the first. It was Netaji who was the first to say to Jinnah, join Congress and you will be the first Prime Minister of independent India.
Exactly. And he writes about that in his book, The Indian Struggle, which is a survey of the Indian movement from 1920 to 1942. And since we are talking about Gandhi and Netaji and their belief in Hindu-Muslim unity and equality, the one anecdote which I think is really marvelous is Netaji, of course, has passed from the scene, but Gandhiji goes to meet the INA prisoners, Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs, Christians in the Red Fort. And they say that we had absolutely no differences when we fought for freedom under Netaji's leadership. But here the British are trying to give us Hindu tea and Muslim tea separately. And Gandhi said that, why do you suffer it? And they replied, we don't. We mix Hindu tea and Muslim tea exactly half and half and then serve. And the same with food. And Gandhi laughed heartily and said, that's very good. And this is from a person who in the early 20s did not believe in interdining or intermarriage. He changed his views over a period of time. And it seems as if he was influenced by Netaji's success in achieving cultural intimacy among India's diverse communities. And that was the aspect of Netaji that he admired most. And every utterance that I've read of Mahatma Gandhi between 1945 and January 1948 on Netaji is in the form of a eulogy. And because of his success in treating everyone equally and bringing them together in the movement for independence.
Professor Bose, I thank you for the detailed manner in which you have informed us about Netaji's views, his relationship with Muslims, the trust he had in them, but also the strong way in which he would have condemned any call for communalism. It's an irony, but a rather delicious one to end on. Many people believe the Modi government is trying to appropriate Netaji's legacy and gain political benefit from it. After everything you've told us about Netaji's views, let's hope they successfully appropriate his views, because if they do, they will have to reverse their positions and change everything that they've said or done. That would be the most delicious irony. It would be Netaji's conquest over Hindutva, even in death. Thank you very much indeed. Take care. Stay safe.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure to talk to you.